Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Mundell, and it's my very special pleasure to welcome you to our special webinar today featuring Dr. Arthur Frank on expanding narrative resources in healthcare. Arthur Frank is Professor Emeritus at the University of Calgary, and he's the author of many books and articles about narrative medicine and ethics, including The Wounded Storyteller, The Renewal of Generosity, and Letting Stories Breathe, a socio-narratology. Today, we'll be talking about some practical applications of narrative theory in healthcare, and I have a number of questions to help guide our conversation today. And then I'll unmute the lines and welcome you to include your questions and comments in the conversation as well. If you prefer, you can type your questions and comments into the chat, and I'll try to monitor the chat as best I can as we go along. Dr. Frank, welcome to the webcast.
Hello, Robert.
It's wonderful to have you join us.
Thank you very much.
I'll start by asking you, if you will, if you could give us a brief update on your current projects and some of the questions and ideas that you're exploring these days.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. In December, I started a blog, and so more about this can be found at www, and it's my full name, Arthur W. Frank, ArthurWFrank.ca for Canada. I really like having the Canadian suffix on this particular website and blog. And what I'm exploring is what I call vulnerable reading. And this is a late career thing for me. I felt I continue to read and review first-person nonfiction illness memoirs, but I felt that I wanted to try something else at this particular point in my career. And my focus in this is on Shakespeare. And I could talk for quite a while and won't about why I chose Shakespeare, but what I'm interested in doing is providing models of reading something, and my something is Shakespeare, from a position of vulnerability. As opposed to how a literary critic would read a book. How do you read a book when you need help? When your life is significantly troubled. And in that trouble, you need a companion. And in my earlier book, Letting Stories Breathe, that's sitting there on your left shoulder, I dealt with how stories become companions to us. And that'll lead us into what you wanted to talk about on narrative resources. But for right now, I'm shifting my primary focus from first-person narratives of illness experience to stories that allow a much broader grasp of problems of suffering and more or less useful ways to encounter suffering. And that's what we find preeminently in all of Shakespeare's plays. So thank you for asking.
Yeah. If I understand correctly, vulnerable reading, it seems like there's something at stake, something critical at stake, and a risk of loss of some kind, or something that requires some narrative resources or opening up of a new narrative world to help move into the experience and move through the experience. Does that sound about right?
The biggest problem in therapy generally is that people can't say. The hardest question is very often the question of, tell me what you need. Tell me what you want. Physicians, especially, and nurses, expect people to be able to answer that question directly and expeditiously, and sometimes you can. I want you to fix my broken leg. I want this pain in my abdomen to go away. Sometimes that question is answerable. In the areas that you work in and the areas that I work in, of how do you live with the long-term changes that illness brings into your life, that question is not so easily answered. People really can't say exactly what they want. What I mean by narrative resources are ways in which we can tell stories, first of all, to ourselves, coherent stories. Second of all, to our circle of loved ones and friends. And then third, to professionals, who may be able to help us in various ways that get at this question of what's hurting me right now, what's troubling me, what's wrong, what is your pain, and are able to turn what is troubling us into a narrative that can be shared. That's the core of this work. And one of my essential premises is that we learn to tell stories by hearing other stories. And Shakespeare's stories are so fundamental because most of them come from older folklore plots. They're so fundamental that they help us learn to become better storytellers. That's a beginning, this issue of narrative resource.
Mm-hmm. So what would be some more narrative resources in healthcare? What could healthcare workers, clinicians use or draw upon to help expand patients' narratives, to be a companion with them in that way?
I've found it useful to use as a sort of metaphor, although it's really not a metaphor, it's really pretty literally true. The title of the American author Tim O'Brien, who writes about the Vietnam War, one of his later books was called The Things They Carried. And he begins the book very poignantly to me with a long list, a paragraph long list of the stuff that was in the pack of a soldier out in the field, out in the rice paddies in Vietnam. And some of it was military stuff. Some of it was ammunition. Some of it was cleaning materials for weapons. Some of it was personal stuff. Some of it was the last letters they'd gotten from home, photographs, maybe a book that they really wanted to have with them. Now, you can ask the same question about people going to the hospital. I think anybody who works in hospitals is attentive to the things that patients bring when they come into the hospital. Their own slippers, their own robe, a silk pillow, a blanket that a family member has crocheted for them, a book, headphones, and a music player. When you put into a small suitcase when you're being admitted to a hospital, that are going to be the things that make that space yours during the period that you're there. And patients who are in the hospital for a longer time can get really creative about making the space around their bed theirs, with cards, flowers, family photos, all manner of things. What I'm most interested in among these things that people bring with them are their stories. People don't just bring their slippers, they bring their stories. And stories are more powerful than slippers because stories imply what our expectations are and how we expect our needs to be met, or ways that we fear our needs are not going to be met. The stories we have about failed care. So people bring all manner of stories with them when they come to the hospital. They bring stories of the last time they were in the hospital. They bring stories about the specialist who referred them there. They bring stories about their relatives and what happened to them when they were in the hospital. They bring stories based on television shows they've seen and movies about hospitals. They bring all kinds of stories. And narrative resources cut two ways. On the patient side, these narrative resources are resources in the sense that they are what people use to make sense of their situation, to understand whether they're getting appropriate care, good care, deficient care, malicious care, what they have to watch out for and what they're entitled to complain about. These stories guide people. On the side of healthcare workers, It's important to know something about these stories, because if you don't understand the baggage that you're inheriting from the whole history of your patient's experiences in medicine. Yeah. And that baggage can make an extraordinary amount of difference in the way in which the patient is reacting to the present healthcare worker. Healthcare workers can sometimes be baffled. Like, why is this person being so suspicious of me? Why are they being so curt with me? Well, it may go back to when they were mistreated by someone before. They may be carrying defenses from their last interaction into this present moment. So I think that I'm constantly imagining my ideal hospital, my perfect utopian hospital of my dreams. When someone's admitted and they've gotten into their room and they're sitting in bed, the first person who comes to see them, who might be a nurse, will sit down and introduce themselves and say, "So please tell me, John or Jane, as you come in here today, what are the stories of previous healthcare that you bring with you?
Mhm.
What are you thinking of when you think of people admitted to the hospital? What stories in your family, what stories in your friendship group come into your head first?" And if people stall on that question, you can say, well, tell me about when you were a child. What's your earliest memory of going to the doctor? What's your earliest memory of receiving medical treatment? Which were the biggest illnesses in your family? What's your memory of those illnesses? You can get people talking quite easily. And once people start to tell stories, the great thing is one story leads to the next story. And it's pretty easy to keep people talking, because patients in medical systems often feel they don't have permission to tell stories. But once you give them that permission, and show that you're willing to listen, they'll tell you quite a few stories. But I don't think healthcare workers have to be afraid of patients going on forever. Most people really do have an off switch after a while.
Mhm.
So that's that's where I think it needs to begin. Family therapists have learned to ask a question generally in the first session after they've identified the problem, the issues that families want to talk about. They'll ask the question, how have you tried to address this problem already? What have you done before? Have you sought other professional help before? Have you read self-help books? Have you tried to institute some kind of family change program? And what aspects of that worked out for you, and why do you think it didn't work out? Because you're here today. So obviously it didn't work out entirely. It's a very important question, because otherwise you risk recapitulating what's failed before.
Mhm.
Same thing is true with people who come into the hospital. If you're going to get their fullest cooperation in your efforts to treat them, you need to know what in previous treatments they consider to have worked, and what about previous treatments they consider to have been futile.
Mhm.
Because otherwise you risk triggering them, to use a contemporary phrase, by starting down a road that they've already been on and they've experienced that as a failure.
You know, I'm thinking of an example about how important it is to prioritize patient stories. And I was part of a patient team conference recently on the seniors rehab unit where I work. And our patient was a 90-year-old female patient. And we sat in a circle with her, and we started with the physician offering her clinical perspectives on the case. And then we went around the circle with each clinician offering his or her own expert opinion on what was happening in the case, until finally the circle came around to the patient herself. And when it was her turn to speak, she paused and she looked each of us in the eye around the circle. And she said, "Do you know what the problem with healthcare is? The problem with healthcare is that none of you knows what it's like to be 90 years old and in hospital." That's the story we should have started with, you
Yeah.
know, prioritize her narrative and to really understand or try to understand what she was thinking and feeling. And I was just longing in that moment for her to tell us what it was like for her. But, you know, in the pace of healthcare today, we never really had that time to hear from her fully.
Yeah. No, it's a wonderful story, and it's exactly on the point that we're talking about. Um, it's so good that that facility included her. So many places would have just they would say, why would we have the patient there? They'd be somewhat embarrassed to have the patient there. So the fact that you included her is a tribute to the facility. But then, as you say, the question is, why didn't you start with her? And my ideal way of starting would be to say, you know, Mrs. Jones, we're all here today. Everybody who's been concerned with your care has a perspective on that from their professional point of view. We'd like to start and end with you. We'd like to start by you telling us, what do you think has gone best and what do you think is still lacking in the care we've tried to provide for you. And then after we've said what we have to say, we want you to conclude for us by telling us at the end which of these expert opinions you find most useful in the care for yourself that you would like to have happen after this conference. That would be my off-the-cuff way of starting a conference like that.
Yes.
Oh gosh, Robert, I hear so much indicating we're moving rapidly in the opposite direction, that we're moving to greater and greater distance. Of course, I don't know if you saw this story last week. It was on a bioethics listserv that I get, and they had a tape from a news program in California. Stuff always happens in California, right? So it's and Kaiser Permanente, which is a big health maintenance organization in California, if somebody doesn't know it already, it has a very good reputation. It's one of the best health systems in the United States in terms of metrics of high quality. But everybody's got their problems, you know? And somebody had the bright idea that they would have these devices, which the family described as a robot. And they had this on the news thing. I saw it, and it was a robot. It was about shoulder high, and it runs around on its little wheels, and it's kind of contoured roughly like a they Stay Puff person thing. And at the top is a computer screen. And the computer screen, it's basically a high-end video communication device. And it wheels itself into the room. And there's Dr. So-and-so off in some remote location, just as I'm on your screen in a remote location. Except Dr. So-and-so is now telling the patient that his lungs are failing and he's expected to die within 72 hours. Mm-hmm. So this screen comes wheeling into the patient's room and says, Fred, 72 hours. Sorry, buddy. Awfully bad. Nothing we can do about it. End of transmission. And the family, of course, was just livid about this. And they, in a brilliant moment of institution speak, Kaiser Permanente said they would be reevaluating their policies with regard to these devices.
Yes.
The thing is, I saw one of these last week in an airport. It was cruising around the airport by itself, and it was some kind of shopping device. And I'm not sure quite how you used it. But there it was in one of the larger airports I was in, going around helping you do your shopping while in the airport. Well, I don't know, sure, in an airport for shopping, that's great. As a way of telling people that their life has come to an end, I think we'd all like something a little bit more human. So
Yes.
That's the world in which we're poised to enter, unless we make some significant decisions about who we want to be in all of this. And that's what a lot of it really comes down to, is making decisions about who we want to be as a society, who healthcare professionals want to be in their professional work, and who, as someone who's ill or as a family member of someone who's ill, what are we willing to put up with? What are we willing to accept, and where do we draw the line on what's acceptable? And it's terribly, terribly difficult for families and for patients in hospital to call what's happening as being unacceptable. Because to put it bluntly, people fear retribution. They fear things will start to go badly for them.
I want to go back to what you were talking about earlier about, the objects that people bring with them into the hospital and how they can be narrative resources to help draw out stories or give a sense of home and comfort in a patient's room.
Yeah.
One of my most memorable experiences was with an elderly Spanish-speaking lady who came to palliative care with very limited family support, and she could not speak English, and so we were limited in our communication with her. And she had very few belongings that I recall that she brought with her. But what she did bring with her as her companion, I guess, was her repertoire of poems that she had memorized from childhood in Nicaragua. And as a gift, she wrote out some of these poems for me from memory. And I just want to show you what it looks like. If it's, very neat, careful handwriting. And these turned out to be two poems by Latin American poets. I thought they were her original poems, but she had this massive repertoire of poetry that she had memorized. And these were her narrative resources as she was struggling to communicate with her clinical team, and it was just so striking for me to connect with her in that way, that poetry became a way that she hailed or interpolated me, I guess, into a relationship with her. And then she gifted these poems to me, and that now these poems have become my story. I think probably my most memorable event in my clinical work.
Yeah.
There's just such a rich treasury there that we need to tap into with each of our patients in unique ways that they present to us.
You remind me of a absolutely beautiful story, and I can't remember who was talking about it, but it was a teacher in a country that had some degree of political oppression, who was requiring students to do just what you were describing, memorize poems. And students then finally complained about, why are we having to memorize all these? And she said, so that if you're in prison, you'll be able to recite them to yourself. And all of us can find ourselves in that situation. I think you're also showing the convergence of what we could call a received text, that is a poem or a story by someone else that a person has learned, the material object that there's then a material instantiation of that story, or in those case poems, and the then expanding penumbra of associations that go with that story as it's accompanied the person through, in this case, our life. And that would be true of a lot of these things. I'm more and more interested in the ways in which material objects support the significance of stories and vice versa. That material objects that mean the most to us it's because we have stories associated with them. And the object in some ways is the repository of those stories. The object triggers those stories. Um, so what a wonderful thing that someone back in that woman's childhood, um, possibly at a time when she herself wasn't that keen on doing the memorization, got her to do it. And honestly, you make me want to go out and start my own program of memorizing poetry. That may be the thing that is the biggest result of this for me, is that I start saying, okay, we need to start taking a short poem a week and memorizing it.
Yeah. One of the things that it's inspired me to do in my current work is to facilitate therapeutic writing groups, where we bring small groups of patients together to reflect on, it might be some object they have with them or some memory or some poetry, and to work together as a group and composing new narratives, to open up narrative resources.
That work is now spreading in all sorts of ways. I was just doing my teaching in Norway that I've been doing regularly for the last years, and my colleague in Norway, Odgar Sines, that's one of the main things he does, is run writing groups in care facilities for extremely elder people. And the stories that you get are of course culturally specific. In Norway, the main story that people will write in those groups is a very lyrical evocation of the rural, generally farm setting where most of these people grew up. And it's a particular Norwegian genre of recollection of childhood home setting. These are especially poignant right now in Norway because a lot of the people who are now in that kind of elderly care facility were children during the Second World War. And in Norway, a lot of children were sent to live with foster families during the war for various reasons, just as they were in Britain. And so a lot of these stories are about their experiences with these foster families and ways in which they either literally became second families or perhaps were not so good and so on. But I think giving people opportunities to give their memories the tactile, visible form of being written down, and then to share those memories, to have others hear those stories and receive them and honor them. That's absolutely crucial work. It extends into work with people who are in early stage Alzheimer's, who still produce very interesting stories and examples of poetry. And it's seems significant for them to be part of these groups, because it still takes them seriously as having a voice.
Yes.
They're being written off in many ways.
Yeah. Perhaps we could shift a little bit and talk about some narrative types and typologies and how clinicians can use your theoretical insights in practical ways. And in The Wounded Storyteller, you outline 3 narrative types: the restitution, chaos, and quest narratives. But you're also very careful to mention that typologies and your typology should not be limited, closed, or finalized. And you said that typologies risk putting stories in boxes, and that there are more than just 3 types, of course. So I'm curious to know, first of all, if you could sketch out for our viewers what the 3 types are in sort of a brief detail, and how you would imagine that clinicians could use your narrative typology in clinical practice.
Absolutely. As you asked the question, I was thinking of the Muppet movie, and that great song in the first Muppet movie, "You can't live with them and you can't live without them." And that's really my view of typologies. Um, you can't live without them because we need to find ways. You use a good verb when we were talking before the others all joined us. When you talked about shaping your listening in the work that you do. We need something to shape our listening. We need to give our listening some form and some purpose. And I think, I'm not sure there is such a thing as just wholly open-ended listening, because we wouldn't know what to listen for. I could say a good deal more about that, but I'll move on. You then can't live with them, because if you shape your listening too much, and I think this is the trouble with a lot of strictly medical listening, you're only listening for specific things and you dismiss everything else. And your listening has way too rigid an agenda. This is the worst use that was made of Kubler-Ross's famous 5 types of, bargaining, acceptance, grief, denial, all of that, is that it became a sort of Procrustean bed, and that was all that people were listening for, and anything else got chopped off. So I was trying to come up with types that were broad enough, so that they wouldn't lead to excluding other things that are being heard, but they also helped give some shape to listening. It's important that anybody's talk about illness includes pretty regularly all 3 of these types of narration, but on a given day or in a given moment, one type is generally in the foreground. So it's a gestalt thing of a foreground and a background. And the other 2 are generally in the background, but one will be emphasized. And for clinicians, that was really the most important message, is which of these types is preeminent today as this person talks about their illness, and how does that shift over time? Because I did intend these as a listening device. The most obvious of these, the narrative that everybody wants and people are quite relentlessly cued as the one they're supposed to be telling, is what I call the restitution narrative. And the basic narrative there is you get sick, the sickness is diagnosed in some way, clinical help is offered for that, and at the end you are restored to at least approximate version of your life before illness. You may not quite be able to do what you were doing before, but you're able to take up a version of life as it was. And a lot of people go into medicine with a presumption of a certain entitlement to the restitution of their life before they got sick. This could be called a fix-it narrative if you want. And it's definitely the one that people in clinics generally, hospitals specifically, are steering patients to, because it's institutionally useful. It carries the message, even if this makes you uncomfortable and maybe flat out miserable right now, there's a long-term payoff. So just put up with it. Put up with the indignities, whatever, of care now, because you're going to get your life back later. And this is just a stage. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's not just a stage. For a lot of people, this is the rest of your life. And for a lot of people, you're not going to get a proximate version of your life back. It's not like a broken leg that the bone may actually be stronger after it heals and you can do everything you did before. It's a permanent change in who you are and who you can be. When that change isn't recognized, and when there are further problems that no care system seems able to address, people fall into what I call the chaos narrative. And the chaos narrative is not strictly a narrative, because in a narrative, one thing leads to another. A narrative is a sequence of events in which people do things, and their doing creates this sequence. In chaos, people do things, but they're futile and nothing really changes. And so it's instead of the narrative going somewhere, which is what narratives are supposed to do, the chaos is really an anti-narrative way of living, insofar as life doesn't move on. Life just stagnates. And the obvious metaphor is a whirlpool. Things just swirl around, and they only can go down, and they go faster and faster as they're going down. So this is a patient who's, I would say, really threatening, certainly depressing, and quite possibly threatening to healthcare workers, because their whole life embodies the limitations of what can be done for some people. They bring the healthcare worker up against the hard limits of what you can offer, because really the hell of it is, people living in chaos are kind of right that all these other possible solutions have been tried and they've failed, and things aren't working. And that's immensely threatening to not just healthcare workers, but people in caring work generally. They want to think that they're able to do something for people. A specific example in your work in palliative care is palliative care's commitment that they're able to control pain. And it's really distressing in situations where they can't control a patient's pain. So the chaos narrative sits there as this whirlpool of what can't be changed, what can't be fixed. What some people find at some point in illness is a third narrative that I call the quest, after sort of an older mythological model. In the quest narrative, there's complete realism about the losses of illness. There may or may not be a sense of potential restitution, but there's not chaos either, because the ill person has realized that there's a particular value that they've discovered in the course of being ill, and they appreciate, they're grateful to the illness for having brought that value into their lives. And this can go badly in certain support groups, where it can turn into something kind of Pollyannish. It can become way too enthusiastic. I'm just so glad I got cancer because I've become such a better person since. There's a book I just love, a graphic memoir, graphic novel about cancer called "Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person." That's fantastic. But that still can be a quest narrative, because cancer also provided the material to write that book. Cancer also, even though she's satirizing that cancer somehow transforms you into someone who's sensitive, wise, all these things, she's making fun of that. Cancer did make her the author of that book. And writing the book can be understood as a quest of her illness. So the quest narrative looks often with blunt realism on exactly how much illness hurts, how much it takes away. But it also finds that there's certain values. And I certainly felt that myself at the end of my own cancer treatment back in the 80s, that God, I was just so glad to get out of there. And I was just so glad to get this sort of visible stigmata of illness, removed, and have the stitches heal and hair grow back and all of this. There are also ways in which I looked on the time I was ill, as weird as it sounds, there were aspects of it that were the best days of my life, in that it was a time when I was living with the greatest openness and sensitivity to the world around me. And in many ways, I've drawn on that capital ever since. I think the best parts of me now what are still in touch with what I was able to see and notice in this really despondent period when I was in chemotherapy. So the quest narrative tries to provide the solace, which is a word I use now in my vulnerable reading project. It tries to provide the solace to people who are becoming ill of saying, look, terrible things are going to happen to you. And we don't want to sugarcoat that. We don't want to give you false expectations about that. But if you listen, if you're able to pay attention, along the way, you'll also have some remarkable moments of perception. You'll also see things in ways that you've never been able to see them before, because being healthy is a particular form of busyness. And being busy is a particular form of blindness. And that's the trouble with healthcare workers. As wonderfully intentioned as they are, they're just too busy. And busyness gets things done, but it's not a condition in which you're able to really perceive. Nor is it a condition from which you're able to engage in the pause that's necessary in order to reach out to people in the most meaningful way. So these three narrative types aren't just listening to the patient devices. For the patient, they're ways of thinking about the story you're telling and that you want to tell. And for healthcare workers, I think there are also ways of listening to yourself. And asking yourself, what's the story I'm most committed to having my patients tell? And how am I subtly cueing them and maybe even coercing them from their point of view into telling that story, at least to me? What's the story that I'm running away from, that I'm threatened by? And what's the story to which I might steer people, that I might perceive in its kind of, incipient form and help develop.
I want to ask you about that, because that's something that I've often pondered when I've considered your three narrative types, and specifically the chaos narrative and its challenges for listening and the anxiety it provokes in listeners and clinicians who want to try to help. And you say in The Wounded Storyteller, there's this ethical imperative that what's needed in clinical work is more tolerance, enhanced tolerance for chaos as a part of a life story. And yet it is so challenging to be with people in their chaos narrative, and the temptation we often have is to steer someone out of their chaos into a more positive narrative, the restitution narrative, for example, or a quest narrative that's very, much a spiritual narrative. There's a lovely memoir by Carrie Egan. She's a hospice chaplain, and she talks about what it's like for her to try to be with people in their suffering. And she says that, there's been times when she's failed to remain present, to not pull back in the face of terrible suffering. She says, I try not to flinch. I try not to be overwhelmed. I try not to run away, but I have. And that's a professional hospice chaplain who meets suffering every day. And it's just so overwhelming and stressful at times for people that, I think we really struggle to be present to people and feel the need to honor the chaos story. But it is so challenging, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I certainly fail routinely. I had this incredibly embarrassing experience a few weeks ago where someone was telling me about a diagnostic thing they're going to have that might or might not indicate something. And I basically responded by going professional. I started talking about professional experiences I'd had of people who'd had this kind of thing. I didn't respond to that person. I I took it upstairs, as a colleague of mine used to say. I put it in some larger frame. And I still am just so embarrassed at my absolute failure to respond to what this meant for this particular person on this particular occasion. You know, I mean, you can make all kinds of excuses for yourself. I was tired, this, that, the other thing, but I just failed. And part of what you need to do this work is an extraordinary tolerance that the passage you read expressed so beautifully. Tolerance for your own failure, for the moments when you just didn't have it, and for whatever reason, you practiced one of the multiple strategies of evasion. And what's really difficult for frontline clinical workers is that the strategies of evasion are often the institutionally preferred ways of doing their work. Mm-hmm. They're often rewarded for being evasive, because that moves them on quickly to the next unit, and that's patients become units of care.
Yes.
And that's the most dangerous thing. So thank you for reading that passage. I don't know her work, and that's beautifully stated.
Is there something in particular that helped you in your illness experience when you were in the chaos narrative, let's say, and you might have experienced a shift towards the quest narrative, or is that something that you reflected on afterwards?
Both. I think it was afterwards that I was able to start putting it together. I mean, I was in fairly short treatment, but it's one of the most invasive chemotherapy regimens that's around. So while this was going on, it was chaotic in the sense that it was just kaboom, 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 one thing after another, and perpetually chasing symptoms and secondary effects, and just living with fear of, is this going to work or not? So it's afterwards that you begin to recollect. But if you're lucky, things will happen to you in the course of this that are there to go back to, and that takes us full circle to narrative resources. I really don't understand why, when I was writing At the Will of the Body, why it is that I didn't include this story. But it was while I was still being misdiagnosed for testicular cancer, and they'd done a bone marrow extraction thing, and that was sent off to the lab, and then part of that test is doing a blood test immediately afterwards for a technical reason. They're looking for some change in blood. So this phlebotomist came in, and at that point I was really pretty sick of people sticking needles into me, so I was not especially glad to see her. And then she was painless. She was one of these people who just really has the art of drawing blood. And I said, you know, that's so great compared to how some of your colleagues are doing this. And she then, and this was all while she was just doing the task she was there to do. It didn't take any extra time, which is important to say for clinical people. She first of all told me that, you know, as a patient, I had certain rights to refuse repeated attempts to take blood. And then she said to me, remember, everyone who touches you affects your healing. And that's one of those moments when, you just say, an angel walked into my room. I was visited by a spiritual being. I don't know how many patients she says that to. It could be kind of a line in her work. But as so often in this, it's not what is said, it's the way it's said. And she said it in a way that was absolutely hurt me. It was the world constricted down to just the two of us, and she seemed to be speaking through a direct pipeline from her deepest part into my deepest part. Mm-hmm. even if you're using a pretty limited repertoire of clinical lines like that, it's all how you say it. And without doing anything that I really noticed to prepare for that, suddenly I was in this extremely intimate relationship with her, intimate in the sense of being known in my suffering, being known in my need, and her responding to that need. Of course, people touch you in all sorts of ways, and the problem with hospital workers is that they're touching people all day long, often a lot of people quickly. And how do you preserve the value of the quality of touch with each of those individual people who's going to remember just you? I think of admissions clerks in hospitals. We're sitting there in a little booth, and it's just one person after another, and they got all this paperwork, and they've got to get it just right, or there are going to be problems later on. And they're admitting, I don't know how many patients a day. They're admitting, 10, 12 people an hour, maybe more. It's a very full day. But each of those patients is going to remember them. Each of those patients is going to remember exactly what was said to them, exactly the sense of hospitality or not that was extended in that first moment of contact, and that sets up all the subsequent moments of contact.
Yes.
And that is a job. To call it difficult is to understate it by such a large factor. How do you be that to each of these people in this way?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my story about such a moment for me.
Just repeat, if you will, what exactly she said, just so that we can all hear it clearly one more time.
She said, "Remember, everyone who touches you affects your healing."
Yes. Yeah, that's lovely. I'm going to unmute the lines now. If there's any questions from participants on the line, now is your opportunity. Let's see if I can unmute everybody. And if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Derek.
Hi, Derek.
And thank you, Art. I work as a narrative medicine teacher in New York. And recently I was speaking to a group of undergrads in Texas who were communications majors in a class called Collective Intelligence. And so I was there not so much as a narrative medicine professional as I was just an outside speaker who looked at problem solving in a unique way. So I was going through my presentation like I always do, and I got to say, most of the traction happened around the one slide that listed the 3 illness narratives.
Oh.
I showed them to you, of course, but that's where the students really, even though it was the day before spring break, really piped in about their personal experience.
Yeah.
Now, this particular audience was not very diverse. And so my question to you is, how do we not fatigue patients or storytellers who may come from a place of trauma or social injustice, so they don't feel worn out just by having to retell their story? Is there a sensitive way to do that? Respected?
Sorry?
Is there a way to do that so they feel heard and respected, but not exhausted?
Yeah, I think you're raising a really important point. And there's no prescriptive answer to that. There's no formula. It's really a matter of just simply paying close attention to the person you're talking to, and looking for signs, either that they are tired, or that this is finally the chance they've been waiting for, and they want to continue. And I think that all that can be said here is it's a matter of so just very close attention, and also just simply asking people, simply saying at the beginning, I want to hear some of your stories. I also don't want to tire you. And so it's important that you tell me when you need to rest, when we've talked enough, and I can come back later. So I think that you can just make that offer. You should make that offer quite explicitly. But then it's also amazing to me how people who will seem really exhausted at the beginning, once they realize that you genuinely want to hear them, that will be energizing for them, and they'll very much want to continue. And I've had any number of very moving stories from colleagues about going to see people who were, really seriously failing in their last days, and there was concern that they were too tired to tell stories and so on. And this seemed to be the moment they'd been waiting for. They were then so grateful for this. Although, again, you have to be very sensitive to when their energies do run out. There's a whole other aspect to you're pointing out that your university audience was not that diverse, and I think sometimes people who do come from particular groups can get awfully tired of being treated as the spokespersons of those groups, and you have to be very careful not to use people a bit instrumentally, so that for any number of different and quite honorable purposes, you're trying to get representatives of that group to speak. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, that's actually very helpful, especially the part about maybe not trying to just do a one-time story gathering session, but to let them have agency and decide how much, how often, and to what depth.
Absolutely. No, I think the offer to come back again is just crucial in doing this work. Absolutely crucial. Of course, one limitation of that can be people who are having short hospital stays, if that's the venue you're working in. And there you have to be honest about the fact that you may not be in a position to visit them once they leave the hospital. As always, honesty is the best policy, and I think people really respond well to what they hear as a candid statement of, this is what we can do, but this is the limits of what I have to offer you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm glad the students enjoyed those three types.
Other questions? Okay.
I'm just kind of curious myself. I want to invite people to speak in ways that are not specifically questions. I would just be very interested in hearing various stories about storytelling in clinical settings, which might be stories about what gets in the way of engaging people in storytelling, or it might be moments when you were able to break through the things that can get in your way, and you had one of these points of connection. I think most clinicians have that was the patient I really connected with story. So please don't think of this as just stories or just questions. Please think of it as we would all benefit from hearing some of your stories of applying this kind of work, because I'm pretty sure that just about everybody who's listening does a version of this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Heather. I have a story. First of all, I'm a graduate of the narrative medicine program at Columbia, and Mr. Frank, we met at one time when you came to lecture. For the last 7 months, I've been intimately involved with my brother's care post double lung transplant surgery in Vancouver. During that, he's received excellent care. And during that time, he has broken 2 or 3 medical barriers. He's made a little bit of medical history. And I've been present in his room. He had a lot of complications, so we've spent most of our time in the hospital. He was in reverse isolation. So for months, he only saw his caregivers wearing yellow gowns, blue gloves, and masks. He only saw their eyes.
Yeah.
Often their name tags were hidden under the gowns.
Yeah.
So he also is a man who's lived alone all his adult life and is not used to being touched. So your comments about touch really resonated with me, because often I would walk in his room and he'd be in the dark weeping, and he'd look up at me and he'd say, "They're at me and they won't leave me alone." And it was the quality of the touch, not so much as how often he was being touched, but eventually the touch became quite traumatic for him because of how much of it there was, but also that it was, I went through the whole experience as a caregiver and his advocate with my narrative medicine training front and center. So I was witnessing the entire experience and participating in it with a different set of values and I was looking at things more specifically than a family caregiver would look. I was watching for, who is listening, what kind of questions are they asking, and what I found in several instances where I would try to bring my own understanding of story and its importance to my brother and its importance to the outcome and its importance to the clinicians in the outcome. I was sort of trying to advocate both sides and foster some kind of narrative medicine experience in the middle of this for everyone. And it was really remarkable the kind of resistance I received from many of his professional caregivers, many of his doctors. But I'll tell you what I did do is every chance I had, and I would speak to student nurses. Oh, there's one young man named Albert, I remember. One night I said to Albert, because my brother was very, very depressed and he was refusing to eat and he was quite grumpy. And I said to Albert, "I know you're so busy, but if you have a chance tonight, if you go in his room tonight in the middle of the night and he's awake and you have 5 minutes, please ask him to tell you a story about himself. Ask him to tell you a story about his time when he was worked as a whitewater guide."
Yeah.
And see what happens. And the next day I came in and Albert ran up to me just beaming and said he had done so and that it had really transformed his idea of caring for Jeff, hearing that story. I'm just wondering how to in situ, when you're in a hospital room like that with a patient, that you can foster your kind of narrative medicine practice or this kind of story practice with the clinicians. But by the way, everybody got a party favor from me that I came into contact with at the hospital, which was a copy of The Wounded Storyteller.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Let me tell you, the situation you're talking about is very difficult because you never have a chance to get the medical team together. They may hardly ever come together.
That's right.
So you're trying to do the whole thing piecemeal, and it becomes just these ad hoc interventions, like your one with Albert, which was just beautiful, and that you gave him the cue he needed to begin to talk to your brother. The best rounds I was ever invited to lead, I guess, was a community smaller hospital in Chicago. And I was doing a visit to a big hospital there, and then this was one of their satellite hospitals. And they invited me to come and interview a woman who had diabetes that was leading to more and more frequent hospitalizations and becoming quite critical for her. And she was causing all manner of problems, as what they defined as problems for the clinical staff. The sort of thing that would be defined clinically as non-adherence or non-compliance. And they asked me to come and interview her. So, great. And they sent me a one-page medical summary, and I read the first line. It started off, you know, Mrs. X is a such and such year old, morbidly obese, and I just quit reading right there. I thought, okay, this is not useful for me to think of encountering this woman. The one thing I noticed was she was born in 1929. This was back in the early 90s. It was before The Wounded Storyteller was published. So we got there, and they introduced me, and she's sitting there, and I'm sitting there, and this room just jammed full of mostly medical residents. Enormous number of people who'd been involved in her care at some point. And she was undoubtedly expecting me to ask some, you know, diabetes question. What I say is, I noticed you were born in 1929. Now, that means you were, or excuse me, she wasn't, I've got my dates wrong. She was born in 1923. So you're born in 1923, means you were 6 years old when the Depression started. She looked at me and I said, yeah, so were you conscious as a child of this enormous change in the world economy, and how did it affect your family? Did this make a difference in the way your family lived, all of a sudden having the bottom fall out of the economy? And it was like she just woke up. I mean, she was like, oh, okay. And she said, did it ever make a change? And she then went off on this incredible thing. This is her version of your brother's whitewater guiding. She went off on this incredible thing about how the family she'd grown up in was a matriarchy. And no men seemed to stay around for any consequential length of time. And she'd grown up with her mother and her grandmother, and the balance of her mother and her grandmother working and taking care of her. And then she extended that on into her adult life and her job she'd had around World War II. Went on. This is what I said earlier about people having an off switch. We covered a lot of territory in her life. How she'd been in Alcoholics Anonymous, just a lot of territory. We got to the end, and the attending physician was so sensitive to what he had seen. He pointed out to these residents that he'd been taking care of this woman as her primary physician for, I don't know, 10 years. And he said he'd learned things about her that morning he just didn't know. And he said, the other thing I want to point out to you is that took 20 minutes. That all the ground we covered, you know, all this incredible, it was a saga that we heard. It only took 20 minutes. You know, Rita Sharon, who you've worked with, who runs the narrative medicine program at Columbia, we'll talk about some of her initial meetings with a patient lasting a couple of hours. And I'm sure she uses that time extremely well, but I also know some clinicians are kind of intimidated by that amount of time. You can get an extraordinary amount of a person's story in 20 minutes. And you don't need the whole story, you just need I'll use your example again, you need the white water parts, because those are what you go back to, again, in terms of what Derek and I were saying. This is what you go back to in subsequent meetings and say, can you tell me a little bit more about the such and such? Yeah. And that also gets at not fatiguing people. I was so gratified that hearing from this physician afterwards, that it really made an extraordinary difference in the relationship that this woman had with this very full room of people, all of whom had been involved in in caring for her in some way. And within a year of that, she was admitted pretty much full time. Basically, she went blind. And I got one last letter that she dictated. And I think things went well, in her care after that. But it was getting everybody into the room in which they had a chance to just experience this person as a completely non-medical person, not as somebody with this or that disease, but as somebody who had lived a life that was fascinating and dense and in its own way heroic in all the things that had been overcome in the course of that life. There's such an enormous problem of burnout among clinicians now. Physicians have the unwanted distinction of being the highest suicide risk of any profession. My basic response to that is you've got to create ways in which you can find your patients to be more interesting. And this rounds was just such an incredible moment of realizing exactly how interesting the life of a perfectly ordinary person really is. And it was just the putting together when she was born and how a major event would have affected her at a particular age. And you can do that with almost anybody in their life. So that's my answer to this. But when somebody is admitted post-surgically into that kind of environment, I think honestly, that's the environment you're talking about of somebody in that kind of infectious control situation. That's just the most difficult environment to work in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of the time, our time for this webcast is drawing to a close. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating online today, for joining us, and very special thanks to you, Dr. Frank, for coming online and having this conversation about such an important topic. It's been a real treat for me, and I'm just so delighted to connect with you in this way. And I continue to read your work, and I look forward to continuing to read your blog and learning from you as we go forward. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. I appreciate that.
Thanks for setting it up, Robert. It's very helpful.
Bye. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.